Welcome to the Building Blocks podcast, where we discuss the career paths of leaders in the energy, utility, and construction fields to better understand the habits, routines, and mindset that has built these successful men and women. I'm your host, Brad Coleman. It took me 20 years to understand my strengths. My goal is to identify the common traits of leaders in our industry to provide you with the tools you need to be successful in a fraction of that time. Thank you for listening. For more information on these guests and others, please come find me on LinkedIn. Thank you for listening. For more information on these guests and others, please come find me on LinkedIn. Welcome to the Building Blocks podcast. This is Brad. I'm here today with Jonathan Core. The goal of Building Blocks, we break down professionals in the construction and utility space to find out how they got to where they are today, different factors that they contribute to their success, what they would tell their younger self, sometimes what to do, what not to do, and advice that they would like to pass along. Jonathan is the owner of his own construction marketing company called Customer Growth, where they help construction companies learn how to build a social media presence and be able to put themselves out there. He also has several other collaborations with other marketing groups and is very involved in the construction industry and teaching construction professionals how to market themselves and be able to promote themselves on social media. Welcome, Jonathan. Could you just fill in a little bit of the background details there that maybe I missed, or the high points that you like to touch on when talking about what you do?
Yeah. So first off, thanks, Brad, for having me on the pod. Great to be on this. I know that we had been talking about you starting something like this. And honestly, I'm just trying to find any opportunity I have to be able to nudge people to create more content. So I'm glad to see the initiative, glad to see you take this action, because I think that speaks louder than maybe the preconceived notion you have of the quality and all these specific. I think the fact that you're taking that step is awesome. I think as far as adding on to what you just mentioned within the intro, I think you covered it all. Like, just to add a little bit more context for me, I grew up in a family of in construction family. Like, my dad was a carpenter when I was young, eventually became a painter, and eventually started his own commercial residential painting company I used to work for during the summers in high school. And so I'd always been around. And but then after that, I was actually supposed to be a musician, and then eventually did that for a few years and eventually pivoted it away and landed back in construction, but specifically commercial. Was an in-house construction marketer, and then more recently, over the past 3-4 years, have been growing my own social media agency, helping commercial contractors build their brand through social media. And even more recently, as of September of 2023, I launched a community called Construction Marketers, where my goal there is to be able to educate and show people how to create the best content in construction. And the reason I started that is because I realized, like, I don't want the only people that benefit from the things that I've learned and the things I've learned over the years through trial and error, studying people, other creators. I don't want it to just be limited to the clients that I work with. I actually want to share the knowledge and be able to help other people just across the board. So whether you're a contractor yourself, a PM, a super, or everything in between, like, you can definitely learn, and I can teach you something, at least the things that I'm knowing. And I'm not an expert by any means. I'm just showcasing exactly what I've learned up to this point with everybody else.
Awesome. Awesome. No, I appreciate that. I know you and I spoke before, and I knew you had talked about a little bit of your background in how you moved into construction. I didn't remember all of the background with your dad growing up in construction, growing up around it, and then the road there through music. And I think you were even in ministry a little bit from what I recall. What eventually led you back into the construction world? Did you feel like you were kind of going back to your roots? Did you approach it from the marketing side? It was the marketing that drew you? Was it getting back to your roots in construction? What did that journey look like? Because that's a pretty big pivot.
Oh yeah, for sure. I think the biggest thing is realizing, okay, I'm a musician. I was in ministry myself, and when you're both a musician and in ministry, you're not doing it for the money. Like, you're not in there to make a ton of money. And I'd recently been married, and I wanted to be able to figure out how to be able to support my family, as well as, I think one of the biggest desires I became aware of is, having seen my dad build his own business, I always wanted to have my own business as well. And so for me, I'm like, okay, I think I want to go start my own business, which is crazy to think. I have no prior business experience. I have no marketing degree or anything like that. But I'm like, for some reason in my mind, I'm like, let's go down this route. of starting my own business. However, I'm like, I'm not sure where to actually begin. And so what I began to do was research everything: sales, marketing, project management, finance. I'm like, okay, there's so many verticals in business that you can go down. And eventually I landed on marketing. And the reason I really liked it is because it's two things. It's one, it's really creative. Like it allows for you to have a lot of creative expression, things like that. And as a musician, naturally drawn towards that. But the other piece though is it's extremely strategic. Like the approach
Mm.
for marketing is not, this is my personal take, especially in construction. A lot of contractors will view marketing as a nice to have, as like, oh, okay, this is just like the bells and whistles. Like this just looks cool. It's like, no, no, there's actual strategic function to it. And so you bring strategy and you bring creativity. And that's in a sense what marketing was for me. And so I'm like, okay, I want to go down this route. And then from there, like during that pivot, when I quit both me and my wife quit our jobs at the same time with nothing lined up, nothing planned. And I ended up for like a few months, ended up becoming a painter again because that, like I said, I'd worked for my dad in high school. So I had familiarity with that. So I found a company that my dad knew and ended up working for them for the summer. And during the meantime, I was actually meeting with a CEO of a commercial painting company, and he basically was helping me make the switch from music into business. And he was, in a sense, kind of like a mentor for me. And I kept meeting with him. We would have lunch. He'd bring me to his office, different conversations, things like that. And so, but I say all this because I was painting over the summer, and the company that I was painting for, I told them that I had a desire to go into marketing. And so by the end of the project that I was working on, which was like a large like condo project, they're like, "Hey, Jonathan, just a heads up, we have a sales marketing role that we're going to begin hiring for. And just curious, I know that you're wanting to go to marketing. Like, what are your thoughts? Do you want to be considered for this role?" And from like, "Oh, this is awesome." And so I end up texting the CEO for this other company, commercial painting company, and they're far bigger, more established. And I texted him. I said, "Hey, I just got this offer of a marketing sales role for them to be able, it's kind of just gets me started in this career path that I want to go down. What are your thoughts?" And within a matter of 5 minutes, the CEO responds saying, "Hey, Jonathan, that's a great idea. I just think you should come and do it for us instead." And for me, I'm just like, "Oh, wow, this is like," it just surprised me completely. And so within a matter of a few days, maybe a day or two, I went to go interview with their CFO, their director of business development, who would become the person I would report to. And within a matter of 2 weeks from that, like I started my journey in construction. So as far as like you asking, was it marketing, construction? It was business first. It was that desire, but then I figured out and narrowed down, okay, it's marketing is exactly what I want to do. And then it's like, okay, what's the avenue for me to be able to get my foot in the door? And me knowing that I have some familiarity with construction and having the relationship of a mentor, that kind of built the pathway forward for me from that standpoint. So yeah.
I love that because you touched on a couple things there. I think it's important whenever we're advising young people on their career paths. For one thing, it's never going to be linear. That's one of the things that I really like to emphasize. My career path was all over the place, and it took 20 years for it to really come full circle.
Yeah.
And even then, I had an old boss that reached out to me for a position after I hadn't spoken to him in 10 years. But
Mm.
the fact is, it kind of just brought me back home, back to my roots. But the time in between wasn't lost. It was just different experiences. And I kind of feel like when what you're saying partly is it took a long time for it to all come together. And maybe even in the middle of it, it didn't feel like it was all coming together. But looking back on it reflectively on our careers, we can kind of see how we draw pieces of inspiration and wisdom from all of those experiences that kind of make up who we are. And it's really interesting that, for one thing, you were very intentional about your learning. When it came down to it and you said, what am I going to get back to? Or what's the ground level, the foundation? Well, I know painting and I know construction. So revert back to what you know. So always lean into that. I think that's very important. And that initiative that you showed to be able to sit down with that CEO and say, look, this is where I'm looking to go. This is what I want. I think those of us that are more experienced now in our careers hope to see that sort of thing. And I wasn't always like that whenever I was in my early 20s. Maybe didn't always had the initiative, but maybe didn't have opportunities or didn't take the opportunities to voice it maybe as much as I should have. So kudos to you definitely for that. I mean, there's several little checkpoints in there that I think that seem to be defining moments that kind of got you to where you are now. So you go to work in-house for this big commercial construction company. This obviously that CEO saw the value in marketing. At that point, what was the objective? Were you directly driving leads? Was it more of social media presence? What sort of a market are you doing for them?
Yeah, so I get in and the first thing I do is actually no marketing at all. What I actually first start doing is by sitting in meetings, asking a lot of questions, getting to know the business better. And I say that because I'm at this point, I'm like 23 years old, maybe 24. And I'm like, I don't know anything about this. And like, yeah, I know construction and yeah, maybe I know painting, but I don't know. Commercial is a whole nother animal, different from residential, as the same thing would be said about industrial. Like industrial coatings or paintings, like very different from commercial. And so for me, my goal was first to just kind of get a feel of the company, understand the company more in depth. Then from there, obviously, I was working with the CEO, CFO, and business development manager. And yeah, we began to kind of devise a plan for content. To answer your first question, is the goal was brand awareness. Like if you were to ask me
Okay.
this back then, it's like, hey, what are you looking to accomplish? I'm like, I don't know, we're trying to do marketing. But now looking back hindsight, I'm like, okay, what we're trying to do is build the brand online. So the way we did that was through social media content. So we had photo content. I would go on site, different projects, grab photos, content, be able to showcase what the company I was working for could work on, things like that. Then also too, I would create they weren't internal, but they were like we called them value videos, but they were about our core values that the company had, and I would go and interview specific people in the company who had a story or had a compelling reason on how they showed this specific value lived out within the company. And so that was video content that we leveraged. We had different website type like project content, things like that. We did some internal stuff too as well, but I think the biggest things were social media content as well as video content and trying to be able to build the brand from the client side as well as from the trying to attract talent to the company. And especially too, you think of all these trades in construction, painting specifically is kind of it's a finishing contractor. So that the tail end of the project and the preconceived notion is like, oh, hey, it's just the painters and things like that. And our goal is how do we rewrite that narrative saying, hey, we're not just like the painters. No, we're an actual legit company. We have staff, we have an office, we have like all these things that like this is a legit established company. How do we showcase that to other people in the industry as well as people who maybe want to enjoy the trades in a compelling manner that isn't just like, oh, hey, we do construction and that's it. No, it's like we want to actually own the brand story and tell that on a consistent basis online.
So you were pretty self-taught on the marketing side at that point, right?
Yep.
Very
No,
knowledge based, but not experience based.
I did do some graphic design in high school. I've always done like some photography, like just in general, even through my phone. Like I never had like a nice camera, but I just like photography. So the creative stuff was always there. But the rest of it literally was just me learning as I went. And that's the hard part for me where I'm like, okay, like obviously the CEO took a gamble on me and something about me resonated with him. Maybe it was the drive, maybe it was the, hey, like he's going to figure it out. And luckily I did go figure it out because the reality is like this isn't always the case. You'll make a hire and you think it's a good bet and it ends up not working out. But in this case, it did work out because like for me, I'm like, okay, I'm gonna figure out how to be able to become great at what this job or this role requires of me. And so like outside of my work, because during work I was practicing or doing the things that I needed to do for my role specifically. But outside of work, I was listening to a ton of podcasts, watching a whole bunch of different videos, different courses. I was like, I'm just trying to soak as much information as I can because I don't have all this knowledge. I don't have a degree. I don't have all these things for marketing specifically. So I'm like, but that doesn't mean that I can't learn the function of marketing. And the best way to do that is by learning by other practitioners. So there's a lot of marketers out there that I would study and try to learn from who are actually doing the thing. Because unfortunately, this is my perspective, there are marketers out there who have a lot of insight here, who have the book knowledge, all sorts of stuff. But when it comes to market themselves, I'm like, okay, what do you have to show for yourself? There's not a lot. So for me, I was leaning more on, okay, who's actually talking about marketing and doing the actual marketing? And then how do I leverage that into what I'm learning and doing now?
I love that extra focus that you put on mastering your craft, learning it and studying it. Was it a combination of the strategic side of marketing and the industry? Because you really liked that it forced you to learn the strategic side of marketing and what to do. But then since you were new to the industry itself, you also had to kind of learn the verbiage and the pain points of the industry and who your target market was, right?
Yeah, so definitely did have to learn that. But I think for me, I think the biggest thing that has helped me up to this point, and I still say this now, is this is to be frank, the construction industry still struggles with marketing. The construction industry doesn't know how to market well. even though construction as a whole is the most fascinating industry, I believe, in the world because of the things that are being built. Like we take dirt and create a whole building out of nothing. But at the same time, we're also shooting ourselves in the foot by not being able to do great marketing. And so I say that because when I came in, I'm like, okay, cool. I'm going to go study all these top contractors and see what the biggest guys, all that sort of stuff are doing. And I'm like, oh, this is not good. This the industry stand? And so I realized I kind of had to step out of construction in order to get inspiration for the content we're creating now. There
Mm.
were some up and comers who were doing really good content, but for the most part, they were the exception and not the rule within the industry.
So what was that like? What was your experience in having to start fresh to say this is what good content is in construction? I mean, instead of disrupting an existing market, it's kind of the age old, is it easier to compete in an area that already exists where you can figure out how to kind of iterate and grow? It's completely different to do something completely new and fresh. What was your approach to that and what was that like?
So naturally, my personality, I want to play the games that nobody else is playing. Like I have that mentality even now with the construction marketers. Like I try to find a community and marketing, things like that, that produce the type of content that I'm now creating and they don't exist. So for me, I'm like, okay, well, I think there's a need considering how many people follow me on a consistent basis on LinkedIn, how much engagement, things like there's a craving for more about marketing. And I'm like, okay, how do I fill that need? So naturally, I'm like, okay, I want to play a game that nobody else is playing. So when it relates to that role specifically, the thing that helped was that the executive or the CEO he's going up against contractors that had far more experience, more established, even though they'd been around for 15 years by this point. Like there's contractors that have 20, 30, 40, 50 years of experience. So you're going up against that. And so it's like, how do we disrupt? How do we go against the grain? How do we do things that they haven't done? How do we play the games that they aren't playing in social media, content, marketing, video? That was the avenue forward. As far as how we figured out what worked, what didn't, it was honestly a lot of trial and error. It's like, okay, let's test this, let's test this. And eventually we figured out the rhythm that worked. And so for an example I like to give is when they were advising me initially, like, okay, Jonathan, we want to go on job sites and grab photos of the work that's being done, work that's completed, all that sort of stuff. I'm like, great. And so I would use a lot of that content for social media. Eventually, I actually took a picture of somebody working or of somebody on a project, things like that. And when I posted that, that post got far more engagement than any other post did in the past. And I'm like, okay, there's something here. There's a reason why in construction, when you think of these happy hours or these golf tournaments, like the people side of construction is very fascinating for people in construction. And I'm like, okay, there's
Mm.
something here. So I began to not only focus on projects, but eventually diversified into the people side. And through that process, it's like, okay, wow, like here's a unique vantage point or a unique angle that we can take for this type of content. But to be honest, it was all trial and error. But the biggest piece that helped though was we had an executive there who wanted to go against the grain, who wanted to play games that nobody else is playing, and in a sense, gave me the liberty to go test and figure out what that was.
What does it say about leadership whenever they give you that rope, if you will, to be able to play with different ideas? And that was his mentality of it was, let's just throw everything against the wall. You have creative freedom to try different stuff and see what works. I mean, what kind of person was he like as a leader?
I mean, obviously, he took a gamble on me. He knows my wife because my wife has known their family for a long time, but I didn't really know them or their family too much. So, like, this is still like somebody he doesn't know. But I think throughout the conversations we would have through lunches, him having me over to his office on the phone, like him kind of mentoring me, helping me get in here. I'm sure he was probably vetting me through the process. Say, hey, is Jonathan like actually a person of his word? Is he taking the action? When I tell him, give him advice, is he taking the advice? I think what's more common is to be on a leash and be like, okay, hey, you have freedom, but you kind of have this box. Versus here is like, okay, there's already established trust. And it seemed as though I gained trust from the entire team to go and explore ideas and in a sense, be the leader. And it was interesting. I remember at one point during my time there, my manager had mentioned, I told him saying, hey, like I was looking at some of these other painting contractors who were doing this. Should we try that or should we do that? And he said, Jonathan, he's like, you know what? We're setting the standard for the industry. So if anything,
Mm.
they should be the ones copying us, but also to the in a sense, they were copying, beginning to do a lot of the things that we were doing. But my thing is like also I'm like, okay, I feel like there's other things I can learn from other contractors. But I think that really kind of put me in like reality to be like, okay, yeah, we are setting the standard. And if I'm looking within internally within the industry, especially direct competitors, for what type of content is going to resonate, then I'm only limited to that. Versus if I go outside of this specific trade or even outside of the industry, I can get new creative ideas on how to approach marketing in a way that leads the industry, even if this practice or approach has already been existing in other industries as well. So I think as far as what it says about leadership is obviously is super trusting, and he took a bet because the reality is like this also could have not worked out. I could have just been a flop and that would have been a bad bet. Maybe I wouldn't be there anymore. Maybe I wouldn't be in the industry anymore. But he took a good bet, and I think it was a calculated bet because he got to know me. Obviously, he's been vetting
Yeah.
me for some time now. But I think that's where for me, especially for people who are younger in the industry, I would always try to like work for a contractor or work at a company where leadership is a little bit younger, and also too where the company is a little bit smaller because you have more room to make an impact. Whereas if you come into a very
Mm.
big and established company, they already have their systems in place. They already have all these infrastructure in place. They have all these things. So like as far as your room to grow or show your impact that you can make in the company, it's probably very small because they've already figured it out. They already have the roadmap forward to they just want to hire you for this specific role. Whereas when you go to a smaller business and a younger company and especially a younger leader, there's more like, hey, we're just figuring it out as it goes. And so whoever comes in and makes an instant impact right away typically has a faster career trajectory. Maybe it is into a future manager, director, or leadership role down the line versus going to the bigger company where it may take you 5, 10, 20 years to be able to get into some actual significant management role. So that's just another takeaway I've had too after working in-house for that, as well as just seeing what it's like working with other small, medium-sized businesses.
And it's been my experience just mostly through observation. I've never worked for one of the big companies, but like a Fortune 500 company, you're going to have a lot more slotted roles, more
Mhm.
defined job titles and job descriptions. And it's going to be more difficult, I think, just personally for you to be more innovative or even creative, maybe outside of what your day-to-day job function is. If you know that's the direction you're going with your career, if it's very set and defined path, it can be a very good career trajectory to follow that. But what you're saying when you're testing things and trying to find your place, and I could definitely see because in smaller companies, everybody likes to say we wear a lot of different hats. Well, that means more opportunity to test things and try different things and a little more creative freedom sometimes.
Yep.
So I think that's really good. So from there, you grow into Jonathan that we know today with your own business, and obviously this seems to be a growth out of that, just the next iteration. But how did you decide to make that leap and grow into kind of what you're doing now with your business?
Yeah, so it all started when the pandemic started. I'm not sure what it was like for you, Brad, but here projects started closing down. Like the pandemic, like they just were uncertain. So projects were closing down for us. And when you think about closing down projects, it was like, hey, there's no revenue or income coming in. And so then you got to start furloughing people. And I wasn't in the first or maybe even second round of furloughs, but eventually I was like the third, maybe second or third round and was laid off. And for me, I'm like the pandemic. I'm like, we never gone through this. I'm like, I don't even know if I'm going to be able to come back. And they wanted to bring me back, but I just didn't know if that was going to be the case. So what I started doing was applying to a lot of other jobs. I'm like, as if, because nothing, I didn't want to put all my eggs in one basket and be like, wait all this time, be like, oh, you're not coming back and you haven't applied to anything. So I was just literally my full time job became applying 8 hours, 9 hours a day, just applying to a ton of companies. And I had a few interviews here and there, but nothing landed. And eventually I had the realization, I'm like, man, if I'm putting this amount of time and effort into trying to find a job, like, what if I just went full in on my own business? Like the same amount of effort, same amount of time, what would happen? And I eventually started talking about it with my wife. We talked about it, kind of looked at risk and what it would look like for us as an exit plan if it didn't work out. And yeah, eventually decided to go that route. And I'm like, okay, cool. I'm going to do this. We're going to do this. We're going to make this happen. And I think within a few days, I get a call. This is like a month after being furloughed. I get a call from my employer saying, "Hey, things are opening up. We want to be able to bring you back." And I'm like, "Actually, I'm not coming back. I'm not going to be coming back. I'm actually going to go and venture off and start my own business." And caught off guard. And eventually, I talked to the CEO. He just wanted to make sure everything was like okay. Like there wasn't any hard. I'm like, there's no hard feelings. Like I totally get why it had to happen, but it really just got me thinking that I've always wanted to have my own business. Going back to what I mentioned, seeing my dad have his own business, and we don't have kids right now. And I just think this is just a good time to be able to take that risk, take that leap. And totally understood. And yeah, and eventually just decided to venture off and start my own business. And luckily, I got a call later from the same contractor said, "Hey, Jonathan, totally get it. You're starting your own business. How's it sound if we were your first client?" And I'm like, "Oh, wow, that's awesome." I was so pumped. I'm like, "Yes, first client." I didn't even have to go selling because sales and stuff like that isn't like a natural bent for me. But we did that, and yeah, and so then from there, yeah, I just began the process of building my business. And to be honest, when I first started my business model was I'll do anything for anybody that pays. Like that was literally what it was, which is not a good business plan. But during the pandemic, I'm like, I just don't know if I could lose everything all at once, or I don't know what it'd be like. So did that, and then little by little eventually focused in, okay, I only offer social media marketing specifically. And first I started helping every industry, then I went to like service-based businesses, then I went to construction, and then now more recently landed on commercial construction over the past 2-ish years. And the more focused I got, the more niche I got, the better my messaging, the more focused my messaging, the more focused my offering became, and my business grew as a result. Because sometimes there was like this mental kind of wall where I'm like, well, if I say no to these people, like I'm throwing money revenue at the door. Like this, now I need to take this. Like I need to say yes to this. And I realized the more I said no and the more I became specific about who I wanted to work with, the more my business grew. So I'd like to say that I got here to where I am overnight and it was all figured out, squared away from the get, but no, it was all just like figuring it out as I went through this whole process.
It's been my observation that sometimes it's not a pull towards something as much as it's a push out the door or away from something else.
Mm.
And you may not have been looking for that, but it definitely seems like it worked out for you exactly the way that it needed to where you are now. I've been in similar situations. I was actually trying to start a consulting business for corporate training when the pandemic hit,
Mhm.
and corporate budgets for training for outside consultants for training, they were worried about keeping the doors open. They certainly were not concerned about what their training budget was going to be for their employees. So yeah, it was definitely a tough time. Looking back at it now, I ended up exactly where I needed to be. And it
Mhm.
got us through a lot of the tough times. I was working from home a lot whenever the kids got sent home from school and they were younger and we had to get them set up and everything. So
Yep.
no, it was absolutely perfect from that standpoint. And that's where sometimes we can't see the individual pieces of the puzzle as we're going through it, but then looking back on it. And if you have the right mindset and perspective, you're always looking for that silver lining anyway. But yeah, sometimes it's always easier to reflect back on that in hindsight to be able to see how it all worked out.
Yeah, for sure. And I think even to like add, just because that stint didn't work doesn't mean it can't work in the future again. Like I think the biggest thing, especially to the realization I've had over the past few years, because I'd always prior to become getting into business and marketing and construction, there was one year I read like over 120 books in one year. I was learning a lot, like, who I was becoming, like in a sense, put myself in this accelerator program, just trying to gain as much information and knowledge because I did want to learn a lot. And I think I kind of was, yes, I wanted to become a business owner, but I think around that time and even just in general, like a lot of these online content creators at that point were like, start your own business, do your own thing, get your life back, all that sort of stuff. And the reality I'm realizing now is like that isn't the case for everybody. Not everybody should start their own business. And one of the biggest realizations I've had recently, and it's kind of reflecting on a video I saw, is I remember watching a video clip of Mark Cuban, and he was on Shark Tank, and he basically said, he's like, I would rather make $50,000 a year, have my own business, than make six figures and work for somebody else. And for me, when I began to think through that, I'm like, yeah, that's true. And some people do it for the money, and I think maybe that is an initial motivation. Okay, you have upside for revenue, income, stuff like that, which is great. But I think now, kind of looking at it hindsight, no, I was made for this. Whether I'm like super successful or what people say, revenue amount, whatever. Like, no, I'm doing exactly what I feel like I'm called to do, which is have my own business. And whether it's big or small or whatever, that doesn't matter. It's just a fact that this is what I feel like I'm called to be doing. And I say that for all the people out there who maybe like, okay, I want to start my own business eventually or things like that. I'm like, really like deeply ask yourself that and try to understand where that motivation is coming from. Is it coming from what you think you want to other people to think about you? Or is it coming from society? Or is it coming from maybe the influence of other people around? And I don't think those things are bad inherently. But I think the reality is, okay, what is it that you want to do? And I think once you begin to reverse engineer and figure out what that is, sometimes it will be a business, sometimes that won't be. And then regardless of which route you go, I think it's as long as you're content and knowing that hey, I'm making the right decision for me, I think that's a good gauge for it. Because a lot of times, and I say this because I was consuming a lot of this information of being your own business owner, your own entrepreneur, all these sort of things. And the reality is like, is this even what I want to do? And I had to ask myself, and I wrestled with that for a bit, but I'm like, no, this is what I'm called to do. Keep in mind, this is with experience, having worked in house and now having my own business and learning to grow it and things like that. Like, no, this is exactly where I'm supposed to be. But the reality is like some people honestly can do really well within an organization. You can work your way up the ranks and make a big impact. And also too, like there are people who work for these big companies that may be like maybe a VP or SVP. You may not be the head honcho like CEO, but they probably make more than some small business owners out there. But they don't have all the risk. They don't have all the having to put so many hats on and manage that. But that's where for me, I'm like, okay, that person is called to do that versus some other people are called to lead their own thing and build their own thing, be it big or small.
In closing, you've seen both sides of it. You've seen the employee side, the entrepreneur side, and been able to go down that, navigate that mental struggle for yourself and doing very well for yourself and very set on the entrepreneurial side. If you were advising young people on how to think about themselves, maybe their own personal qualities, risk tolerances, how would you advise them on where to look for where they fit in that puzzle of employee, entrepreneur, somewhere in between? Where would you guide them?
So I'll guide them by this framework that I created maybe 9 months ago, maybe almost a year now. And I titled it Life Mapping. So
Okay.
what I ended up doing, there's this saying or there's this quote from Stephen Covey in the book of 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. One of them is begin with the end in mind. And for me, I wanted to figure out a way to make that a reality. So what I ended up doing is like, okay, let's say Jonathan is 70 years old right now and he's accomplished all these sort of like, what would an ideal day look like for him at that point? And keep in mind, at least at this point, I don't see myself ever retiring. So I picture myself working, doing something, contributing. The idea of retiring doesn't sound appealing to me, at least at this point. And so I'm like, okay, what would I want to be doing? And the biggest theme, and so I started writing down things, a whole bunch of things. I just like, okay, I want to be doing this and this. Like, okay, what are the themes in that? And I realized the biggest theme and what I want to do at the end of my life, and honestly for the rest of my life, is creating, like the idea to create. So as a musician, I love creating music. As a marketer, I love creating content. And then also too, as a person who loves relationships and loves people and wants to build relationships, I love creating new relationships with people. So I'm like, so the theme is creating. And so my goal there from that is like, okay, how do I architect or build my life in a way in which I get to that? I like, how do I create more content? How do I give myself more room to be able to eventually create music? And then how do I also leave margin to be able to create and build relationships with those that I love? And so from there, then I began the process of, okay, reverse engineering. What sort of things do I need to do now? And to be frank, that's where construction marketers kind of came about. I'm like, if I'm able to eventually go down the path of being like a full-time content creator and doing that would in a sense get me already living and doing exactly what it is I want to do. And so that's an example of how I did it. However, I was talking to a client maybe 6 months ago. I walked him through this like kind of life mapping framework that I'd been working on or creating that just out of necessity for myself. He began doing that with himself as well. And so I just know the biggest thing is like reverse engineering. It's like by the end of your life, what would your ideal life look like? And I'm asking this from the context of what kind of contributions would you like to make from the into the world? And the reality is sometimes some people have big dreams, some people have small dreams, and some people have dreams in between. But you want to be realistic with yourself and you want to ask it from for me, it'd be like, what does Jonathan really want? What does he desire? What does he want to do every day? And then figuring out what it will take. Because the reality is like, this is not going to be an overnight thing. Like, this is going to take some time to get there. But as long as that your career, the decisions you're making with your family, the decisions you're making with your friends, who you're hanging out with, the stuff that you're consuming, like all these things are all hyper focused on getting you back to this specific desired goal. And I realized that actually gave a lot more clarity to my career and journey because now it's easier for me to say no to things. To be like, hey, Jonathan, you want to do this? And I go back, I'm like, well, does this take me to where I want to go? Does this take me to my desired outcome 40, 50 years from now? Like, if it doesn't, then no, I don't have capacity to do that. But if it does, or somehow it meshes with that, it's like, okay, let's explore this. It doesn't mean it's gonna be a yes right away, but let's explore this. And so for me, I think it allows for me to get hyper focused. And so I think for me, if I were to recommend any young person out there, I would say try to figure out, okay, what do you want your ideal life to look like from the context of contributing back to the world? Because I know that there's some people who may want to say, I want to be on vacation, I want to travel, I want to do it. I'm like, great, that's all. Like most people want to do that stuff. But let's go past that. What sort of contributions are you making to the world? And that may be in utilities, that may be in construction, that may be in tech, that may be in e-commerce. Like there's so many verticals in which you can go down. But I think once you get crystal clear out, and maybe not even crystal clear, maybe you just have a general idea what that is. Then you begin kind of figuring out, okay, I need to go to this company. I need to make this next move. I need to be able to get in this role in order for that to eventually get me to where I want to go. So that's what I would advise. Versus what happens is we just look around and see what everybody else is doing and do what they do, but then end up building a life 40 years down the road and be like, I actually did not like what I did. I hated my job. I didn't like it, but I just felt as though society or I was just doing whatever everybody expected of me, or this is what my parents wanted me to do. I'm like, no, no, you have to really take time to reflect. And I know that this is easier said than done. And I think counseling, so I've a counselor myself for years now. And I think maybe that has helped me become more aware of, myself. So maybe some of that too. But I think if you sit in that moment of like, okay, what is it that I want to do? And then reverse engineer, I think that will at least give you a rough template of as far as how to get to the actual outcome that you want to get to.
Man, wow. Okay. There was a lot in there. One thing I would add was in doing a similar version of the life mapping exercise myself, what I have found is don't put too much pressure on yourself about the time nature of it.
Yep.
You do have to create a bit of a sense of urgency. So there has to be it has to be time bound to a certain extent. But also when I did it, it's like, oh, I have to do this in the next year. And so then you lose patience and then you burn out on trying to seek those goals. But two things that really popped up when you
Yeah.
were saying that, both of them by Tim Ferriss. One of them, I think it's in 4 Hour Work Week. He said, you don't want $1 million. You want the freedoms that you think having $1 million would create in your life. Because that's what we think. We think if I had the money, then it solves the problems.
Yep.
And sometimes I think this kind of lends to your idea of actually doing that life mapping scenario where it's like, don't think about when I get the money, I'll do this. Think about, like you said, testing everything. What are most people not doing? All of the marketing strategies that you use, we can implement those concepts for our life. When you think about that Tim Ferriss quote, there's actually, I was trying to find the particular episode, but there was another episode of Tim Ferriss podcast where his guest actually has them do on the episode. She goes through her perfect day scenario is what she calls it. And I think it was early in the Tim Ferriss podcast, like probably within the first 100 episodes. And I can't find who that was right now, but that's a really good way to walk through the different, what would you want your life to look like if you could map out your perfect day? And it's not going to be just sitting on the beach all day long. It has to be productive to a certain extent, but it has to be, the best thing is to find yourself in service to someone or something or a greater purpose in some way. And you said that as well. I think that's a really good point because that's ultimately what's going to be your driving factor.
Yeah. And the thing I was going to say though, too, everybody has their own kind of camp that they side on of like, go figure out your passion and then never work a day in your life. I'm like, great. But then also too, there are people who are really good at specific things that maybe they're not passionate about, but they're really good at, and that will contribute to society. I think that's just as important as well. And the example I like to use for somebody that may not be doing, and this is just my perception, what they love, but find outlets to do it, is this guy named David Solomon. He is the CEO of Goldman Sachs, and he's a CEO of obviously one of the most influential financial firms in the country, but really in the world. And so he's obviously got tons of assets under management, all that sort of stuff. But the funny part though, but by night he's a DJ in New York City. Like he's DJing at these clubs. The CEO that's probably worth tons of, his net worth is huge, probably has tons of stocks options. But for me, that's an example of like, hey, he has this job that maybe I don't know if he enjoys or not. Like that's to be decided, but he's contributing a ton to society through the skill set that he has that allows for him to be able to express himself in a creative way. And that's the same thing for me as a musician. I'm like, I realized once I disassociated my creativity with needing to make money from it, it actually made my process way easier. Cause I'm like, now I don't have to make music to make money. I'm making music because this is exactly what I want to be creating. So that's another way to think about life mapping too. Is like, it doesn't necessarily mean you have to that what you desire to do every single day doesn't mean you're gonna do that for your full-time job. No, like you need to make a living. But what is that role that maybe you're really good at that allows for you, that offers you that flexibility to eventually do what it is that you desire deep down inside? So there's hybrids of that. So I don't want to say this is exactly what you're gonna do for the rest of your life. And for those who end up taking that leap, awesome. Like I honestly wish them the best and I hope that it works out. But for those that are like, okay, I know I need a job and need to contribute to something, but also too that gives me the freedom to do and explore these other passions that I have that aren't related to monetary value or trying to get paid for it. That's a good thing as well. So that's just an example of a CEO who's doing that, living that out now here in the United States.
Yeah, and the only thing I would add to that is be strict with what that vision is for you and where you want to go, but then flexible maybe in how it's executed
Yep.
because there are twists and turns and sometimes
Yep.
things don't play out and test things when you can and try to get creative from that perspective. Well, I really appreciate you coming on and talking to me with so many really valuable pieces of advice and wisdom here. What's the best way for people to find you, to connect with you? Tell us how they can find you.
Yeah, the best place is LinkedIn. Jonathan Core, last name Cor. Yeah, that's the place where I'm posting tons of content for construction. But the thing though is like I have people who are not in construction who follow me as well because I post content on personal branding, just anything that helps within a marketing perspective. And somebody who's actually doing the marketing for contractors, doing my own marketing, and just sharing all the wisdom and advice that I learn along the way. So that's gonna be the best place to connect with me.
Like, yeah, I mean, I've been a huge beneficiary of that. I've texted you several times and said, hey, that post that you had today about how to start doing long form video content, I wrote it all down and copying that script for myself because sometimes it's that barrier to entry is the intimidation factor of starting something new and not knowing where to start. So personally, I want to say thank you for the content that you're putting out. And sometimes our reach is further than we realize, and there's a lot more value to be gained than maybe the particular person you think you're talking to whenever you put out something like that.
Yeah, for sure. And yeah, thanks for the support, the feedback. Obviously, that's always greatly appreciated. But here's the really cool part for me from this entire conversation is that I'm not sure which episode this is. I don't know if this is like the first five or whatever. I'm not sure where that's at, but I'm excited to see what this looks like 1, 2, 3 years down the line, Brad. Like I'm excited, one, that you've taken the action, that you're already doing this stuff, but the reality is like your first podcast episode is gonna be far different than episode 50, episode 100. And so as long as you stick to it and do this, I'm telling you, man, it works. I know firsthand from my own experience that it works. I've only restarted again the past 6 months, but I'm starting to already see the impact of it. So I just want to commend you for taking the action. Continue to do this, man. And I know that you're going to bring a lot of insight to a lot of young professionals as well as anybody else who gets their ears on this podcast.
Thanks, man. I appreciate that so much. And I already am planning to bring back some of the early guests, including yourself. So I look forward to talking to you again.
Yeah, man.
All right. Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Building Blocks podcast. If you found anything beneficial from today, I would appreciate you reaching out and letting me know on LinkedIn. I'm always looking for ways to add value to the listeners and interviewing leaders in our industry. If you found this helpful, I would appreciate if you leave us a review and reach out to me on LinkedIn and give me some feedback. In addition, if you know someone that would be good for an interview, please let me know and I'd be happy to connect with them. You can find myself and any of the other guests on LinkedIn where we continue the conversations about leadership, careers, growth, and development.